Good evening and welcome to our presentation this evening. For those of you who are new to Environment Haliburton, my name is Susan Hay and I'm your host for our event tonight. We are excited to have Baz Conlin as our speaker for the second time, and I'm going to start off by asking Greta to give our land acknowledgement.
We respectfully acknowledge that the land which we call Haliburton County is the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, and is also within the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. The intent and spirit of the treaties that form the legal basis of Canada bind us to share the land for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow.
Thanks, Greta. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you'd like to ask Baz a question, we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the talk. And so please type your questions into the chat function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't mind, please mute yourself so as not to distract from the presentation. We are recording the event, and if you don't want your face showing on the screen, you might want to turn off your camera. Tonight's speaker is Baz Conlin, and he's the owner and operator of Haliburton Micromeadows, located near Lachlan, and has become a highly sought-after speaker about native plants and their roles in the ecosystem. In fact, he was speaking last night as well. So Baz is going to talk about the ecological importance of grasses, rushes, and sedges. And I confess that when he suggested the topic of sedges, I was a bit surprised. And I had never thought of sedges as having a great deal of ecological significance, but tonight we're going to find out why. And now I'm going to hand this over to Baz, and he's going to share his screen.
All right.
Over
Thanks
to you.
very much for that introduction, Susan here. I'm just gonna, 1 second here. All right. That should be it.
That's great.
Sorry, hold on 1 second. Oop. Oh, there we go. All right. I think it's is that it there?
It looks good to me.
Yes. Looks good.
Yep.
All right, perfect. Um, all right, so just move this screen out of the way here. Just formatting it on my computer. All right, so thanks everybody. So as Susan said, my name is Baz. I run a small native plant nursery in Lachlan. This is my third year, entering my third year doing it. So I specialize in providing perennials, shrubs, small trees that are locally native to the region. So people can, for people's habitat projects, if you're doing a pollinator garden, if you're replanting a shoreline or a woodland meadow or something like that. Those are the plants that I'm trying to produce in large amounts. So, and I get my seed locally, so all the plants that you're getting from me are suited to this environment. One group of plants that I'm focusing very heavily on this year, as you may have guessed, are grasses, rushes, and sedges. So, to give you kind of a little breakdown about this talk, this group of plants is extremely ecologically important. You only have to think of grasslands. Grasslands are called grasslands because of the importance and dominance of grasses and in these ecosystems. Surely, I'm when I say grasses in this talk, I'm mostly talking about grasses, rushes, and sedges. But I'm just going to say grasses to keep it kind of short there. So grasses are in their environments, grasses are ecological keystone species. If we took them from their environments, I mean, if we took grasses out of grasslands, they would just be lands. So in this photo here, this is a sedge meadow, and you can see how these sedges are just dominating this environment and really kind of creating the foundation of this environment and holding it all together. That's something I'll talk about in a little bit. But I'm going to kind of give an overview of why grasses are important ecologically, in terms of carbon storage and things like that. And then I'm going to kind of break it down by by environment. So I'm going to talk about grasses that you can find in wet meadows, dry areas, and places like that, and kind of how they fit into their environment and how you can use them in your home landscapes as well. All right, to start this, so it all starts with the carbon cycle. I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of this. It's kind of a refresher for a lot of people, but basically we have microbes, we have things decomposing in the soil. Us, as we breathe, we're releasing carbon. Human emissions, of course, are is releasing a lot of carbon. That carbon dioxide, in the form of carbon dioxide, goes into the atmosphere. It then gets absorbed by green plants through photosynthesis, and then that carbon gets stored in the plants' bodies and then in the soil as plant roots and decomposition will get stored down in there. So keeping that in mind, um, grasses do an exceptional job of storing carbon. This is kind of a little tidbit, but I was reading about this today. There's a potentially hypothetical compound protein called glomalin, and it's that kind of that cloudy stuff that you're seeing around the roots. I say hypothetical because it's a controversial thing in science, but the idea is that this glomalin increases the amount of carbon that plant roots can store. So it's actually gluing, beneficial fungi and large amounts of carbon, actually sucking it and attaching it to plant roots. So plant roots have this really, really unique ability to store carbon underground. Thanks possibly in part to this. If there's somebody who's a soil scientist and knows a lot more about this than me, please comment because I may have got that completely wrong. But anyway, I wanted to share that. Um, so let's think of a tall grass prairie. So we don't really have tall grass prairie habitat here. That's more like a Western thing or a Southwestern Ontario kind of thing. But we'll just use it as kind of an example. If you have a tall grass prairie, you'll have, grasses like this big blue stem that get really tall. And then if the soil's deep and loose enough, you can have roots that go down 10 feet or potentially more. Um, because of those extremely deep root systems that the plants are growing annually, they can store anywhere from zero point 0.3 to 1.7 metric tons of carbon per acre, just in the root system is getting put into the ground. And what's really interesting about this is because the roots are underground, the carbon's being stored. Um, if you think about forests, for example, forests are storing most of their carbon in their bodies, like in the trunks of the trees, in the leaves. It's mostly above ground. Um, if you go to a forest and you log a forest or a forest burns, that carbon gets released back into the environment. But with grasslands, including wetlands like this sedge meadow here, they're storing that carbon mostly as the roots and locking it underground where it has much less of a chance of escaping into the atmosphere. So because of this, grasslands are incredible carbon sinks. You could have uh, grasslands. I found figures of anywhere from 80 to over 250 tons of carbon being stored underground per acre for grasslands, which is incredible. To put that into perspective, a lot of our northern forests, I read a few different stats when I was researching this, and a forest, from what I read, and I could be wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they store roughly 75 to 85 tons of carbon per acre. So you compare that to 80 to 250 tons per acre for a grassland. It's a pretty significant carbon sink. All right. Put this into viewer mode. Sorry about that. I messed my screen up a little bit. I'm just gonna fix that. Sorry. All right, that should be fine there now. All right, apologies for that. Another great use for grasses is in erosion control because they have those really thick, long root systems. Pictured here is switchgrass. This is often used in erosion control projects. You'll see it a lot here in Haliburton. You're not really usually going to see it growing out in the wild, but you'll often see it planted along the edges of highways. This is a planting that was actually in Peterborough. It was behind a Walmart. They did a whole bunch of construction and disturbed a hillside, and then they came over and they sowed switchgrass into on the slope that they disturbed, and it grows very fast. It's really robust, and it has a really strong root system. So you can use these grasses in erosion control very effectively. Grasses also are a really important part of naturalistic gardens. This was an old garden that I did in Peterborough, and you can see I used predominantly grasses in the planting of this. This is a naturalistic kind of micromeadow planting, which is what my company is named after. And the goal with this is to provide a naturalistic planting by including about 60% grasses for the total planting, maybe about 40% or less flowers. And it creates that nice green matrix where everything kind of flows together and looks a little bit less messy than if you just had lots of flowers everywhere. It sort of cushions everything. So grasses are wonderful in landscaping. They're also very, very great for wildlife. There's a lot of wildlife that depends on grasses. One of them is the Leonard skipper. You'll find this one up in the Highlands. Its larvae feed mainly on grasses. Species like lovegrass or agrostis, the larvae feed on that. And a lot of other species of skipper butterflies and other species of butterflies and moths feed exclusively on grasses. Because of this, grass creates great opportunity for birds. So a lot of birds, sparrows, grassland specialists like meadowlarks or bobolinks, bluebirds, all sorts of different species will hunt for caterpillars and other insects like grasshoppers that are really abundant in grasslands. Reptiles also use grasslands, snakes, especially leopard frogs. Smooth green snakes really like meadow habitat, so they really benefit from open meadows. You're not really going to find these species in like a closed forest sort of environment. And then birds, everything from, excuse me, from rare birds like the eastern whippoorwill, which is a species at risk, to common birds like red-winged blackbirds, which use wet grasslands, marshes to nest in. Whippoorwills don't necessarily nest in grasslands, but they use that open habitat to hunt. So they're very important for their long-term survival on the landscape. But at this point, what are grasses? So I kind of want to just explain a little bit define what I'm talking about when I'm saying grasses. So scientifically, they're in the order Poales. It says order twice. On the bottom, it's supposed to be family. So the order Poales, the grasses, rushes, and sedges. And then there's 4 different families. So we're talking about the Poaceae, which are the grasses, the Juncaceae, which are the rushes, Cyperaceae, which are sedges, and Typhaceae, which are the cattails. And these are all very easy to tell apart. I have pictures of 3 of the families on the bottom. By the end of this talk, you should be able to tell them apart pretty easily. So these are just some graphics I found online. Sedges, there's 2 mnemonics that we use to kind of remember how to tell these apart. There's sedges have edges, rushes are ground, grasses are hollow. So sedges, if you cut the stem and cut the leaves in cross sections, sedges will have edges. Rushes will be round, but they won't be hollow, and grasses will be hollow. Another mnemonic that I really like is, edges. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses have knees that bend to the ground. A prominent feature of the grass family Poaceae is that they have knees that kind of joint the stems. So if you notice that, it's likely a grass. So those are 2 different mnemonics. That might help you. And then cattails are cattails. They're identified by having that big iconic seed head and very robust thick root systems. All right. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but these are just some images if anybody's interested about kind of some grass and sedge anatomy. These are just anatomy points that you should learn if you want to learn to identify grasses and sedges yourself. Kind of You're going to want to know about things like the floret, the spikelet, the inflorescence, and you can use dichotomous keys to kind of key the grasses out. One of my favorite books for that is, I don't know if you guys can, well, I guess you guys can't really, I don't know if you can see my camera on there because I can't really see it from my perspective, but Grasses by Lauren Brown is a really, really great book that has diagrams like this for I think almost 200 species of grasses. So um, great source for learning how to identify that. This is the flower seed head of a sedge, and it's just kind of pointing out a few anatomy points that are important for identifying sedges. This is from Lizzie Harper's website. Lizzie Harper's a really, really great illustrator. She has lots of really cool diagrams like this. All right, so um, what I'm kind of attempting to do with this talk is I'm going to kind of break down a few of our more common and easier to identify grasses and sedges so that you can kind of start noticing them in your environment. One of the reasons I wanted to do this talk is because sometimes a lot of us, even, naturalists, we can kind of have plant blindness where we're surrounded by green things everywhere. We kind of forget what we're looking at. And that happens a lot with grasses. We think, grasses, it's all weeds, it's all just tall blades. But when you stop and you look at them, you realize that there's a very incredible diversity. Um, Haliburton Flora, this book on the side here, you can read this book for free if you search Haliburton Flora. There's an Internet Archive link. It's the first one that comes up on Google. And you can look at this book for free, or you can order it in from the library. And it has a checklist of all the different species of grasses and sedges recorded in Haliburton at that time. It was 1991, and they found, I think, just over 200 species. On iNaturalist, I searched for species that were research grade that were confirmed sightings, and they have about 182 species of grasses, rushes, and sedges recorded just for Haliburton. So it's really big diversity, and I'm not going to be able to get through all of it, but I'm going to attempt to get through some of it. So the first habitat that I want to talk about are wet meadows. I don't think we often think about wet meadows, well, meadows, but like wetlands in general as being grasslands. But they could be considered grasslands. So this wet meadow here is dominated by sedges. It's mostly tussock sedge and a few other species. And then you can see in different areas, mostly where there's been disturbance because of the water level going up and down. There's species like blue vervain, swamp milkweed, cardinal flower growing amongst the grasses. But you'll notice here that the water level has gone really down. This picture was taken in July, and those sedges are holding like the whole shoreline together. If they weren't there, that would just be a mud pile. So you can really, really see the work that those thick root systems do in holding these ecosystems together, literally. You'll find all sorts of different species of insects in these habitats, like broadwing skippers. Their caterpillars feed on wetland sedges. You'll also see larger animals like moose. They love sedge meadows. In wetlands, anywhere where there's these kind of open areas where they can find, plants to forage on. They like foraging on stuff like white meadow sweet, which is what this guy's sniffing at here. Um, in Haliburton, one of the most abundant grasses that we have in sedges. So, sorry, let me back up for a second. The format of these, I'm gonna keep it grasses, rushes, and sedges. So I'm gonna talk in each section. I'm gonna talk about some grass species first, and then a couple of rushes, and then sedges at the end. Um, so here's a few species of grasses that you'll find in wet meadows. Probably our most abundant one is Canadian blue joint grass. That's the Calamagrostis. It's if you look at the photos, you just think, oh, that's just grass. I see that everywhere. But it's a fairly distinct species. It has, when it's done flowering, it has this kind of bluish tinge to it that you can see here. And it's very leafy, but the leaves are very fine. I know this isn't necessarily botanical taxonomy here, but I want you to kind of get a feel of what these look like. So they often form nice large colonies like this, but they're not usually so dense that they block other species out. So you'll see behind me on my hand there, that field of Canadian blue joint. There's all sorts of different species of sedges and flowers growing amongst that. Um, but it's not to be confused with this species. This is an invasive species, reed canary grass. So you notice the inflorescence, the seed head looks fairly similar. They both grow kind of in the same habitat, like in wet kind of mucky soils. But one of them, this one, Canadian blue joint, is a native species that's beneficial, that doesn't crowd out other species of plants. Whereas the reed canary grass does. It's extremely invasive, very thick root system. Some sources list it as being native to North America, others have it as invasive. There is a native form of it, but there's so many robust cultivars that have been used mainly in livestock feed, and they've escaped farms and they can just wreak havoc. If you get this in, if you create some disturbance and you get this in a wetland, or um, I see it a lot on old farm properties that had grazing, you'll see it's just gone from, the field and just goes into the wetlands and it just takes over everything and nothing can grow in it. You identify it by looking at the sheaths. So on reed canary grass, where the leaf connects to the stem, it has that wave. Whereas on the side here on the right, that's Canadian blue joint. So they look very similar, but you can always tell them apart if you look at the where the leaf sheath connects to the stem. It's wavy, curly like that on reed canary grass, and straight on the Canadian blue joint. All right. Another grass you're likely to encounter in Haliburton is sweetgrass. It's a very kind of it's a grass that's easy to miss. I see it the most when it flowers early in the spring. It flowers in May, and the flower heads they come up, they're about maybe a foot and a half, and they have these bright yellow, tiny little flowers. And I notice them mostly along the sides of the roads. There's this one roadside in Haliburton where it's like, I swear, like 5 kilometers just of sweetgrass. So it's present here, but it's a species I know I notice mostly in disturbed areas, ditches, roadside stuff like that. This patch of sweetgrass is growing at the meadow, at the nursery. I have kind of a rain garden that I've built, and so I've planted sweetgrass in there. It has a reputation for being aggressive in kind of a garden setting, and it definitely spreads fast. But just like the Canadian blue joint, it allows for other species to grow up amongst it. So it'll create, a big colony of itself, but there's still, seedlings underneath and there's still plants poking through. So it's not invasive that way. Um, One way to identify sweetgrass is the leaves. The leaves will, aside from the obvious smell, the very strong vanilla smell, you'll notice that the leaves will be shiny on the top and then pale underneath. So that's another way to identify it. These are what the seed heads look like. Sometimes the seeds stay on over the winter. These are some plants I grew at the nursery. Um, Woolgrass, there's so many different species of rushes. But just for time, I decided to kind of just talk about one, and that's woolgrass. Really common up here. Great for use in wetlands and reclaiming space and reclaiming wet spaces. Great for shorelines. Um, it's worth mentioning too that shoreline recommendations for Ontario are at least 3+ meters from a shoreline. So if if you're looking for, plants that are really going to work and really fill out space on your shoreline to, help with erosion control, help with geese coming up on your lawn, that sort of thing. Species like woolgrass are really, really are your ally in this, because you can plant a few individual plants and quickly they'll grow and spread out and self-seed and create these kind of living hedges along your shoreline. So woolgrass is one of those ones. It's really easy to identify by those thick woolly seed heads. There's a few other species of rush in the same genus that look similar, so they can get confused, but woolgrass is the largest and most robust. All right, moving into the sedges. Again, there's lots of species of sedges that I could talk about. So I'm kind of trying to keep it to the ones that are most commonly encountered in Haliburton. And I might have to skip across some of them, but one of the most common wetland sedges in Haliburton is the fringed sedge, so Carex crenita. This one is identify. It tends to be in large clumps, and it has these large hanging inflorescences or seed heads that are just really, really easy to see. The drooping, because the way that they droop like that, they're pretty, nothing else really looks like them that's growing in wetlands in this area. So really easy to identify. They're usually growing in the same space as sallow sedge. There's a couple other species that look similar to this, but sallow sedge has those really long kind of spikes at the ends of the seeds there. Um, and you'll find both of them growing in wetlands in usually big, huge clumps of themselves. They'll form big, huge colonies and create this really dense, really rich habitat. With a lot of these native grasses too, they tend to be clump forming. So they'll spread out and they'll form colonies of themselves, but the individual plants are clumps. And this is kind of what helps allow plants to grow between them, and it allows wildlife to kind of make their way through these thick tangles without getting trapped. Um, a sedge that I thought that was worth mentioning is Carex lasiocarpa. There's a couple common names for it. So woolly fruited sedge, you can see the fruits here. They do look kind of woolly. Wiregrass sedge is another name for it. I prefer woolly fruited because it's more descriptive, but Carex lasiocarpa is your classic pioneer species. Um, when you have a situation like a beaver dam breaks and that water drains out and then dries up, and then you have kind of a sedge meadow that comes up after that. Carex lasiocarpa is one of the more common pioneer species that'll show up and kind of dominate those areas. You can see here, this was an old beaver pond that has since converted over many years to a sedge meadow. And a lot of this, what you're seeing is Carex lasiocarpa. So it quickly fills in these disturbed areas. It grows really quickly, and it just kind of does its thing. It locks the ecosystem together, and it allows for the conditions for trees to start growing in. You can see that there's black spruce on the edges that are starting to kind of grow into there. There's all sorts of different types of shrubs. There's Labrador tea and meadowsweet and chokeberry kind of growing in from the sides as well. And it's all because the carex kind of springs into action and really holds that ground together, holds the moisture into the ground, and starts creating those conditions for succession. Another important sedge that you'll find in the same place is tussock sedge. This is really common. A great place to see this if you're in Minden is there's like that boardwalk that's behind the cultural center. There's a big patch of tussock sedge right there, right in the parking lot. So really easy to see. It forms these big, thick tussocks that are just these big piles of root that will kind of sit. They kind of form their own little islands, and this makes them really adaptable to changes in water depth. So they can survive flooding, they can survive drought, and they create this really interesting structure in wetlands that allow for a lot of different species to flourish. That's what their inflorescence here looks like. Right. Another common wetland sedge. This one's not as common in Haliburton. It's really, really common south of the Shield. You'll find it in a few areas up here in Haliburton, and that's fox sedge. Really, really easy to identify by that big, distinct inflorescence that kind of looks like a foxtail. Um, just from this image, you could confuse it with some other types of sedges just by looking at the image. That's why I think grasses and sedges, they're way easier to learn when you see them in person. Um, with photographs, it's sometimes hard to tell what you're looking at, but when you see them in person, it's a lot easier. So fox sedge, if you saw it in person, it's very distinct. It's a big forms a big clump, and then it has these big kind of foxtail like inflorescence that come out all over it. It's very distinct. It works really, really good in landscaping. So you can use it in a wet area. You can use it kind of on a forest edge. Really, really adaptable species. This is a species you'll see anywhere where there's like an acidic kind of environment. You'll see this in bogs. You'll see this sometimes like in fens, different, wetlands like that with acidic water, tawny cotton grass. So very common in Haliburton. If you've ever kind of looked out and you've seen kind of a big field of these, puffs of grasses, and it's a wetland with black spruce and things like that. It was probably tawny cotton grass. We have another species called tussock cotton grass. That's more of a clump former. But you can always tell tawny cotton grass because it has that tawny look to its seed heads, and it tends to form large colonies. So you'll usually find this species in bogs. Um, Bogs are acidic wetlands with still water, usually deep layers of peat. Um, Very hard for many plant species to thrive, but tawny cotton grass does great there, and grows, amongst sphagnum mosses and things like that, and helps to hold those ecosystems together. All right. How are we for time here? We're doing pretty good. I want to talk about cattails. This is something some people might not realize. So we have two species of cattail. There's broadleaf cattail and narrowleaf cattail in the area. One of them is native and one of them is an invasive species. So our native species, which is the more common one up here, you can see on the left-hand side there, its leaves are almost twice as wide as the invasive narrowleaf cattail. Um, it can get kind of tricky to identify them because they do hybridize. Um, but normally you would see the narrowleaf cattail in a disturbed environment. Broadleaf cattails usually in a more wild, less disturbed environment. But you can tell the difference between their leaves. Um, the narrowleaf cattail is surprisingly common. It was brought over, I think, in the 1800s for like floral arrangements, and it's in disturbed areas, especially south of the Shield. It can sometimes be the dominant cattail. So if you've gone and if you've seen a cattail marsh and you've just seen it where it's like nothing but cattails, that's probably narrowleaf cattail. It's very invasive. It pushes a lot of species out and it forms huge monocultures where our native broadleaf cattail, it also creates large patches, but other species can grow between it. Cattails are important to species like cattail borer moths. Very quickly, a cool story about this moth. So the larvae, they bore inside of the stems of cattails, and cattails are very porous on the inside, and they hold a lot of water. So if the cattail breaks, the larva falls out, it can actually swim to shore and find another cattail to bore into. So I've seen that before. I've snapped a cattail, and the larva will swim out. So kind of an interesting sort of side story about that moth. All right, worth talking about is Phragmites. This is a non-native grass, an invasive species that a lot of people are probably familiar with. It has those large feather-shaped, plume-like seed heads, and usually when you find it, you find a lot of it. It loves disturbance, so you'll find it on roadsides. If you disturb a wetland, it can kind of come in and then it can really quickly take over. This is one of those plants where there's not much. If you have a true, like a really large infestation of Phragmites, you sometimes can remove it by hand. You can do that when they're really young. But often the only way to deal with them is by using pesticides. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to just very briefly tell a few facts about pesticide use when it comes to invasive species. So, pesticides in Ontario, they can only be applied by a person with a pesticide license. So, you can get like different companies to come spray for you. They use a 2% glyphosate solution, so that's Roundup, which is a non-selective herbicide, so it can kill other plants. But when it's used in a situation like this, the glyphosate is sprayed directly on the leaves and then gets absorbed into the roots and it kills the plants pretty quickly, usually without harming neighboring plants. Spraying pesticides in an aquatic environment, you need to get special permits for that. And then the mixture of glyphosate that they use in aquatic environments, it doesn't have a surfactant, so it doesn't stick to things. So it actually doesn't harm aquatic wildlife, and it has a really low chance of harming neighboring aquatic plants. So it's very, very target specific. It's a broad spectrum herbicide, so it can kill any plant, but it's very targeted in that it's just applied to individual plants. So if you have like a big infestation of Phragmites and you have the means, sometimes going with a licensed herbicide applicator who can go through getting the permits is a really good idea because it's worth it's worth spraying a little bit of that to save a wetland if that's the case. Obviously you want to try other methods first, but that's just kind of the situation when it comes to certain invasive species. All right, another invasive species I want to talk about quickly is Miscanthus grass. Miscanthus is very popular. A lot of people have it in their gardens. You can identify it immediately. It has that very beautiful silver seed head, and it's usually very large. It's becoming a bit of a problem. It's in southern Ontario. It's basically Phragmites on land, so you'll usually find this grass in drier areas. So it's like Phragmites on land. I've seen huge patches of it along the highway down towards Toronto. It's spreading all over Peterborough, and I'm finding it along the highway in places like Gooderham, in Stanhope. It's really starting to spread. It's usually sold in nurseries as sterile, but they produce like thousands of seeds. So if a plant's, not even 99% sterile, it's producing thousands of seeds, it's producing a lot of viable seeds. And so they eventually get into the ecosystem. Sometimes they come in soil, like if if you're not disposing yard waste properly, it can get into the environment that way. But it's really becoming an issue. So it's something to kind of keep your eyes open for. All right, another invasive species, this one again is more on dry land, is smooth brome. It's everywhere. It's really easy to identify. You could look this one up yourself if you want to learn more information, but easy to identify, very invasive grass. The flowers are really distinct, and then the seed heads kind of bend like that. If you're in an old field anywhere that's been disturbed, if there's been grazing or agricultural use, the dominant grass is probably going to be smooth brome. So very invasive species, and it's I don't know if it's planted as much anymore, but it was planted a lot for livestock feed. So it kind of gets into the environment that way from farms and disturbed areas, like that. Okay, so that's some stuff that I wanted to say about sort of wet meadows. Now I want to talk about forests and shady areas because we don't often think of these as being grasslands, probably because they're woodlands, but grasses can have a pretty large component of certain forest environments, so it's worth mentioning. The first species I want to talk about, this is a bit of an obscure species, but it's one of my personal favorites, is white-grained mountain rice, also sometimes called rough leaved mountain rice. So easy to identify in the spring. These are the spring flowers. It comes up. It has these seed heads that kind of look like rice. It's not related to rice, but it sort of looks like rice with these little white flowers. Those little tufts that you see on there are the flowers. Um, so a lot easier to see in the spring when it comes up. It's a bunch forming grass, and it looks wonderful in gardens and is an important component of hardwood forest ecosystems. Another grass that you'll often see in forests or on forest edges, I usually see this on forest edges, is Mexican muley. It's one of those species that once you notice it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. It's often found on the edges of forests, so it'll come in and fill disturbed areas. A lot of species of grass-feeding butterflies and skippers use it as a host plant. There's a lot of, in particular, I always find seed bugs on them. So small little bugs that specialize on eating seeds, and other ones that like different types of leaf hoppers and stuff. I usually find a good diversity of them on Mexican muley. There's a close-up of what the inflorescence looks like. So when you catch it when it's still green, it usually has this kind of almost lavender, grayish, purpley tinge to it. And that's one of the key defining features of Mexican muley. It's very fine. It's very satiny. Another name for Mexican muley is satin grass. because the inflorescence is like satin. It's very smooth. So you can find a lot of these in the sculpture forest in Haliburton. Is one place to look for them, but any forest edge, there's usually a lot of that. All right, bottlebrush grass is another species that's worth talking about. You'll find this in forests. It has really distinct inflorescence there, very spiky seeds. It does great in woodland gardens. It does great in naturalizing projects. Butterflies really love it. So northern pearly eye butterfly. Anyway, the caterpillars love bottlebrush grass and other types of woodland grasses. So there's a whole group of butterflies that look like northern pearly eyes that are brown and have those eye spots, and a lot of them specialize on feeding on their caterpillars specialize on eating woodland grasses. Okay, thought this would be worth talking about. This is pathrush. Pathrush is a very common species. People ask me a lot if there's a type of grass or plant that can withstand a lot of foot traffic, and pathrush is probably the one that can withstand the most. This is on a very weathered path. This is in a kind of a semi-wet area that's mostly shaded, and it's a very worn path. But you can see that the rush, it doesn't like you can walk on it. Once it's really established, it handles foot traffic great. It gets less than a foot tall, and it'll self-sow and form like a thick lawn of itself if the conditions are right. I find it prefers a bit of a clay soil, but it grows here in the nursery in acidic sand. And it shows up. It's funny because it shows up by itself pretty much anywhere that you start to blaze a path. Like if I start a new path in the meadow here, it's the first plant that'll come up. So there's lots of it usually in the seed bank already. So pathrush is a species definitely to look into if you need something that can withstand foot traffic. That's what the inflorescence looks like up close. All right, so how am I for time? Doing okay, but I'm going to have to kind of go through these a little bit fast. These are some woodland sedges, so bladder sedge, very easy species to identify. The seeds that I'm just going to call them the seeds for now, that's the non-technical term, are large and they kind of look like bladders. Um, Super easy to identify. Nothing really looks like it in Haliburton. You'll find them kind of in wet areas. I usually see them around vernal pools. Places like that where it's shady and usually a little bit wet. It can get large. I've seen large specimens that are like a good 3 feet. But it usually is, maybe 2 feet tall, and it'll form kind of a loose colony of itself. All right, plantain leaf sedge. Sometimes it's called seersucker sedge. This is it when it's flowering in the spring. Some people might not be familiar with the fact that grasses, sedges, and rushes that they're flowering plants. So they're not necessarily producing flowers that are attracting, butterflies, bees, and stuff, but they are reproducing by flowering. So these are male flower structures. They release pollen, which is then carried on the air and then pollinates female flowers. So this is plantain leaf sedge early in the spring. They keep their leaves. They have evergreen leaves, so very easy to identify if you come across this in a forest. I usually see them in kind of floodplain forests. You can find them at uh, the HHTL property, Barnum Woods. You can find them there. But very easy to identify in the spring. And then they have these super easy to identify leaves, like these huge, thick leaves that no other sedge has. So nothing else really looks like it out in the forest. Another woodland sedge. I like using this one in landscaping. The plantain leaf sedge is also really good in landscaping, but long spike sedge is really good. Sometimes it's called springle sedge. And it's identified by that big, long spike on the end of the seeds. Really good in landscaping because it forms a nice, thick, upright bunch that's really decorative. It's hard to kind of appreciate it in a photo like this, but when you see a nice row of long spike sedge, they just look really good together. The seed heads catch the light. It looks really good on a forest edge, and that's sort of what it looks like there. All right, another good woodland sedge is graceful sedge. again, little, kind of hard to see. This is from my old forest garden in Peterborough. I would mix graceful sedge in with everything else, and it kind of just fills in the spaces. You'll find this one often in Haliburton. Again, it's usually I find it in ditches, wet kind of forest edges. It can handle a lot of shade, but it seems to like I tend to find it in areas with more mineral soil. It can be identified easily by looking at the sheaths. So at the base of where the sheaths are at the base of the plant, it has purple sheaths. So that's what you're seeing right there. So if you see a plant that has these kind of dangling inflorescence, and then you look at the bottom and it has purple sheaths, it's likely graceful sedge. All right, another one worth mentioning, rosy sedge. This is a nice clump former. Not very common in Haliburton, but it can handle really dry soil. So if you have a really, really dry spot, this is a great one for filling in those areas. It'll grow in dry shade where nothing else will grow. Another one that is great for woodland gardens is woodland sedge, Carex blanda. Another one that's not as common in Haliburton. You'll find it in Torrey Hill. You'll find it kind of in Minden. In between, not so much. Every now and then it shows up. But very distinct seed heads. I would kind of describe them. They almost look like some type of candy, or they almost look waxed, like little beads. And they will send up that inflorescence, and then after they create their seeds, they kind of flop over, and then they'll kind of grow another patch of grass, another patch of leaves in the center of that. So they make a really kind of interesting landscape feature that will change throughout the seasons. The seeds on woodland sedge, because they produce a lot of seeds and the seeds are very large, so birds love to eat them. So you'll get like sparrows, you'll get finches, you'll get all sorts of birds that'll come and forage and eat those seeds. All right, this is an image from Monarch Gardens website, and this just sort of shows like a lawn that has been converted to woodland sedges. So you can sort of see how they work as a landscape feature. They're really good for kind of replicating the look and feel of a lawn, but without having to mow them or really maintain them much. Um, and the landscape features that they're providing in this, urban kind of context, they're providing the same benefits in our ecosystems as well by, holding soil together, contributing nutrients and biomass to the soil, and creating, areas where wildlife can, hide and find food and, yada yada. All right. Alvars. This is something I'm going to touch very briefly on. We don't have any alvars in Haliburton County, but if you drive from where I am about 40 minutes southwest, there's the Cardin alvar, which is a very large alvar. For those that aren't familiar with what an alvar is basically a an area usually an open area. Sometimes they could be forest, sometimes they could be shrubland, sometimes they could be grassland, and they're on top of limestone bedrock with very thin soil. So if you go down to the Cardinal Alvar in Kirkfield, you'll see big, huge open plains that look like that, with underlying limestone bedrock and then very thin soil. So it creates these kind of extreme conditions that allow for otherwise very rare species in the province to be really locally common. So what we're looking at in this photo here, that kind of yellow grass in the background, that's little blue stem. So little blue stem is really good in landscaping. The photo on the left is at Lucas House in Haliburton. That was planted by Simon Payne, who does grounded gardens. He does garden installation service. So go look him up if you don't know that. That's grounded gardens. But he planted a whole bunch of little blue stem at Lucas House, and it had a whole bunch of benefits. It looks really great. It's this beautiful greenish blue color in the summer. In the fall, it's this just lovely huge mass of seed heads that catch the sun. The photo doesn't do it justice at all. When the seed heads catch the sun, it's just absolutely gorgeous. And deer don't eat them either. So they're just a really, really smart landscaping choice. They get maybe about 3 to 4 feet tall. But what we did actually, I collect seed for a project run by Oak Ridges Moraine Trust with in partnership with whole lot of organizations called the Kirtland's Warbler Project. So myself, a lot of organizations, a lot of other seed collectors were collecting seed to restore farmland into native grasslands with a bunch of rare species. And one of the species that they really are in need of is little blue stem. You can buy a little blue stem from seed suppliers, but most seed suppliers in Ontario, whether they know it or not, the little blue stem that they sell is usually a cultivar. So it's like a bred version, like a cultivated version of that plant. Um, what I've noticed is that these cultivars, they tend to be very blue, like electric blue, and they don't usually produce seed until late in the year. So when they do produce seed, it's just a little bit of seed. Whereas our native little blue stem, the one that you're seeing on the left there, it comes from a population that originates. So it originates from a population in Kawartha Lakes. So it goes to seed in September. The little blue stem that I've tried from seed companies, it doesn't go to seed sometimes till November, and then it only produces a little bit of seed. So if we were buying seed for the Kirtland's Warbler project and throwing a bunch of seed that was going to create plants that weren't going to produce more plants, it would just be a waste of money. So it's really important to get local ecotype seed, and this is an example of that. But anyway, yammering about that. Just going to touch on these very quickly. These are two species that one, the prairie drop seed you can find on alvars. Cytox grama, you'll find that more in prairies, and it's really rare. I think there's like one population in Kawartha Lakes and a few in southern Ontario. But they work really well together in a landscape. So prairie drop seed, it's a great plant if you're doing, a liner um, on the edge of a path or something. But you'll also find that growing out on harsh alvar conditions where few other plants can grow. All right, rock barrens are a little bit more typical of Haliburton. They are one of our main ecotypes in the county are open granite and gneiss rock barrens. So they basically look like this. I took this photo in November. So open granite bedrock, covered in mostly lichens, reindeer lichens, a few different types of mosses, stunted uh, pine trees, red oaks, and then the main plant growing between everything that's holding all the soil together is usually poverty oak grass, which looks like this. Out of all the grasses that I've shown you today, it's probably the easiest to identify. Another name for it is curly hair grass. So it's the old blades of grass will curl up. And so if you see a grass that looks like that, where it's like a clump of curly, um, dried up grass blades, that's poverty oak grass. Nothing else looks like it. So it will form colonies in the harshest conditions, in thin acidic soil on bedrock, sand. Here it is at the nursery. I planted a whole bunch of it at the nursery. This is what it looks like when it is allowed to go to seed. It gets maybe about 2-ish feet tall. So it creates this lovely flowing kind of meadow effect. And this is growing in, thin soil, thin sand. So really important species. It's really hard to get seed for this one, but it's really, really, really valuable in restorations, especially in dry areas, disturbed areas, for a few reasons. One of them is that it's a cool season species. So I showed you little blue stem. Little blue stem needs kind of a longer growing season usually to reproduce and grow. It does most of its growing during the summer when it's really hot. Cool season grasses like poverty oats, they do most of their growing on the shoulder seasons. So they're growing in the spring and in the fall when it's cold. And so they have an advantage up here over planting something like, if something like little blue stem. So ideally, if you had a choice, if you were planting a meadow and you had to choose between, do I want to plant little blue stem or poverty oats, you'd probably want to plant poverty oats, but that's in a perfect world where seed is available. All right. All right. This is the Crixus arctic butterfly. It uses poverty oats as its host plant. You can find them in barren areas in a few different spots in the county. All right, sand dropseed is another species you'll find in these dry areas. Really easy to notice in the summer or in the fall when it creates these really interesting sheathed inflorescences. I'm getting kind of late now, so I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip a couple of these. I was going to talk about oak sedge. It's a great plant. You'll find it kind of growing in forests, and it's really good if you want to kind of create a lawn effect in, forested environment. Drooping woodland sedge. I'm gonna kind of go through a couple of these. Um, all right, sorry. The last section, this is a very, very quick section, so we're almost at the end. I want to talk about tallgrass prairie and oak savanna. These are kind of like the grasslands. Like when we're talking about grasslands, we're usually talking about tallgrass prairie and oak savanna typically. We don't have any of those in Haliburton. The closest there's Eels Creek and Apsley. There's a small, like less than an acre patch of tall grass plants. But you'll find these like in Pontypool area, there's tall grass prairie. In Northumberland County, there's tall grass prairie, and in spots of southwestern Ontario, there's patches of it. There's only like 1% or less of original tallgrass prairie in Ontario. It's always been kind of an uncommon habitat, but it's a super rare ecosystem now, and it's identified by a few different characteristics. So in this photo here, you might just you might just say, oh, that's just a field of grass, but it's a field of particular grasses. Um, Tallgrass prairies are dominated by usually a few different species of tall grasses, usually big blue stem, savanna grass, little blue stem. These are warm season bunch grasses that have a very long um, lifespan. So basically, like a plant like big blue stem, in tallgrass prairies and oak savannas, some of them are estimated to have been tallgrass prairies for over 4,000 years. Some of these patches, where we just have big blue stem that's reproducing through root rhizomes and kind of like infinitely cloning itself. And so it's interesting to think about it because it's like, what is the lifespan of a grass that can continuously clone itself and live in an ecosystem for 4,000 years in the case of some of these tallgrass prairie remnants. So um, that's sort of what makes these prairies different than something like an old field with weeds and non-native grasses that's going to quickly become a forest. Prairies are also, even though they're old growth and they're you know these kind of stable-ish ecosystems, they need management. So prescribed burns are really important. I got to see my first prescribed burn happen earlier this spring. I didn't do anything other than take this photo, but Lands and Forests and Nature Conservancy did a really good job burning this area. So this is a tallgrass prairie remnant in Northumberland County, and they get burnt in the spring, usually on a rotation. And this keeps out, invading trees and shrubs and things like that, and it encourages the grasses to grow and keeps the ecosystems healthy. And in a few months, it would look something like this. So, habitat for bobolink. The main grass is a tall grass prairie species like big blue stem. Very easy to tell. It has that turkey foot seed head. There's savanna grass. Old name for it is Indian grass. You usually see it still listed as that, but savanna grass is what most people are calling it now. So Sargassum nutans. It looks very similar to that smooth brome that we saw earlier, but the seed heads are this like beautiful copper color, and they get very tall. They can get anywhere from 5 feet in poor soil to 8 feet in good soil. Right, and they're really cool because even on grasses you'll find rare species. This is a Galechiid moth. I forget the name right now, but its larvae only feed on the flowers of savanna grass, little blue stem, and big blue stem. So you have these big prairies with these tall grasses, and they're supporting these tiny little specialist insects, in addition to tons of other species as well. All right, this is the second to last slide here. This is something I could talk a lot more about, but people always ask me about what type of sedges grow really well in sunny areas. I listed a few already, but one of them is Plains oval sedge. It's a large, kind of robust sedge, but it can grow in full sun, dry soil, no problem. This is from Monarch Gardens website. They did a lawn replacement with it. That's a close-up of what the seed heads look like. You're not likely to find this in Haliburton. Again, this is like a prairie plant, so you'll probably find this in like Northumberland County South. All right. So hopefully we still have a good amount of time, and we can take on some questions.
My husband's going to look after the Q&A. Keith, are you there?
Bet. I wonder, do you want to take down your
Oh, yeah.
screen share and then we can see people
Yeah.
as well? But I'll start by saying that I know far more about sedges, reeds, and grasses than I did an hour ago. So thank you very much. Really
Good.
very interesting
I
presentation.
was
Baz,
hoping not to overwhelm everybody, but it's just a very small introduction. I could probably go on for like 5 hours if you let me.
That's
would
quite
you
all right.
would you
Uh,
mind stopping sharing your screen, Baz?
Here she is.
Oh,
There it is.
great.
So there was lots of comments in the chat, and I'll summarize a few of them. Bonnie from Ottawa put a shameless plug in for the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library and left the URL if you're interested.
Where do I have it? That's funny. Hold on 1 second. I don't know if you guys can see that on the camera there, but I just got my own delivery of seeds from them. They are wonderful. So Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library, they're great. They're a group of really dedicated volunteers, and they send out thousands of free packs of seeds, including lots of grasses and sedges. So go check them out.
That's great. As I mentioned, the URL is in the chat near the top. Um, One of the participants wondered if you could talk a little bit more about where you get your seeds. You said you source them locally, but if you could tell us a little bit more about that process.
Oh yeah. So I very much excuse me, try to get all my seeds sourced locally. Locally is something that, you can have different definitions of. Excuse me. I try to keep my seed collecting source from within about 100 kilometers of here. So Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Hastings, Peterborough, and then a little bit into Northumberland County. That's getting a little bit further south. But what I do is I go out into the field. I find the species I'm looking for, and then I'll collect a few seeds from them. I tend to avoid like rare species or species at risk, things like that. If you find, if you're looking at a road sign, you find one individual, probably won't collect I probably won't collect seeds from like, a single individual plant. But like in the case of little blue stem or something, if there's a big patch of it, I will collect seed from that. And then I use that to grow my nursery stock, and I know where the seeds originated from. In the case of the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library, the seeds that I got from them, I got Bowman's root seed. And Bowman's root is a plant that's extirpated from Ontario. So that's one of those situations where I can't go in the wild and collect them. So
Great example. Specific question, how tall does woolgrass grow?
it can get pretty tall. It can get anywhere from 4 to 5 feet, I would say. It all depends on how rich and wet the soil is.
I fear I know the answer to this, but Anya wanted to know if any of the grasses, reeds, sedges, or cattails, or a combination thereof, could outcompete Phragmites.
That's a difficult one. So the way that Phragmites gets in is because usually there's some type of disturbance. And it's able to kind of exploit that disturbance and then spread out and really take over other plants. I had a client this past year. He was wonderful, and he hired me to go to his property and remove a very small patch of Phragmites. And I was pulling that out, and you wouldn't believe the root systems on them. They are insane. They are very long. Some of them I was pulling out 6 foot long roots from just single stemmed plants. And what they do is like, other invasive species, they will grow sometimes on the shoulder season. So they're growing when it's cooler, but then they're also growing when it's warmer. And so you'll have surrounding plants like cattails that are dormant, but that Phragmites is still growing and still, and that's how they're able to kind of outcompete them. So if you're understanding this kind of that Phragmites, they're relying on disturbance, and then when they get in, they're growing when the other plants are not growing. It can kind of be hard to come up with a combination to keep them out. The best thing is that if you do have Phragmites, to get rid of it, reduce the disturbance, and then try to get a really good mixture of grasses and sedges in there. Um, Probably the most aggressive Canadian blue joint is really aggressive. The native broadleaf cattail is pretty aggressive in those situations. And woolgrass is also a really good spreader in those ones. So a combination of those would probably work.
Well, that was a
Can I
great
just
question.
I
Go ahead, Anya, please.
can I just ask if you think that if provincial legislation made sure that companies that make roads had to clean their equipment properly, that it would reduce the spread of Phragmites?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I just thought I'd bring that up because I do believe
Yes.
that's how it spread. But
Yes, definitely. Thank you for bringing that up because you're right about that.
thank you.
Yes.
Terry points out that a podcast she saw suggested that most of the cattails were, in fact, hybrid in our environment. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, the hybrids, I'm not super sure how to tell. I don't know if you can necessarily tell by sight or if it's like a genetic testing that they have to do. I'm not super familiar with that. But I know I've talked to different researchers and they have said that a lot of the cattails that grow on roadsides and in disturbed areas are actually either the hybrid or the non-native species.
I'm sorry I didn't ask this one before I asked that. Someone asked about biocontrol moth for Phragmites. Is that something you're aware of?
I think I've heard about that, that they have moth that they released for biocontrols. I know biocontrols have worked for different plants in the past, like purple loosestrife. The purple loosestrife beetle, they had really good success with that. I remember hearing something about a moth for Phragmites. I don't know if they've released them in the past or if they were just opportunistic species, but we already have, I think, probably about two or three species of moth that specialize on Phragmites that come from Europe, that have established themselves in Ontario. So whether they're effective biocontrols or not, I'm not sure, but yeah, it's something good to watch. And anything that helps reduce the spread of that is something worth paying attention to.
Right. Literature is rife with various species that were introduced to control another one and then themselves became invasive and a far greater problem than the original.
For sure.
A great question. How long are grass seeds viable?
That's a good question. So it depends on the species. So sedges outside of the soil have a lot less viability. When I grow my sedges, usually I have to sow the seed fresh, especially with woodland sedges. They rot really quickly. They like to be underground like pretty much immediately, but a lot of grasses have really good viability. So something like a big blue stem is a great example. If you keep those seeds dry and in a cool environment, you can easily get anywhere from 5 to 10 years off them, probably longer.
One of the participants commented that she grew seeds from northern wildflowers for little blue stem grass, and based on your description, is not a cultivar, and she was happy to know that.
That's good.
Um, Pat asks, how well can various plants survive wildfires or regenerate after a fire? You might even comment on some of the flowers that require fire to reproduce.
For sure. So it all depends on the intensity of the fire. Like if you have like a really intense fire, like a proper forest fire, where you're burning right down to the mineral soil, and a lot of plants are getting killed. You're looking at species that have been sitting dormant in the seed bank for a long time. So like something like fireweed is really well known to come up after something like that. Also, pines tend to regenerate really well after those fires. But if we're thinking about more like a low intensity fire, like a prairie burn, or even small wildflowers fires, some not necessarily fire, but something you can think about, drought. Sometimes drought acts in a similar way as fire, where it causes the top part of the plants to kind of die off. Um, I'll back up a little bit. So if we're talking about fire, like prescribed burns in like a grassland kind of situation, it's doing a few different things. So one, it's removing the top layer of biomass, which allows the mineral soil to be exposed, which allows more plant seeds to germinate. It also returns those nutrients back to the soil. It creates a black soil that in the spring can heat up really quickly and accelerate plant growth. For grasses, I've noticed I grow big blue stem and little blue stem as just clumps here. And in the spring, I always go to my clumps and I set them on fire. And that early spring fire, it just makes the grasses grow really tall. I think it stimulates something in the root crown, and it makes it actually send out more shoots. Great example. This is another plant that we don't really have that lives up here, but cylindrical blazing star. That's the Liatris cylindracea, or dwarf blazing star. It's a short little plant, only gets maybe 1 or 2 feet tall, with like a 15-foot long root system. And it loves fire. So in areas that get burned recently, it'll send out tons and tons of stems the following year. So that's one example of a plant that would require fire. So
Thank you.
hopefully that answered your question. I think I got all of it.
Um, Question is, someone asked about recommendations for a dry area with poor soil with only a few hours of sun.
Everybody always asks for that. That's probably the number one situation, because that's one of the hardest things to plant in. So we're talking, probably dry soil, probably mineral soil, mostly shade. If we're talking about sedges and grasses, something like rosy sedge, Carex rosea, would do really well there. Bottlebush grass, Mexican muley would do really well there. Um, Pennsylvania sedge, oak sedge. I didn't get to talk about that one very much because I was yammering too much, but it's a great species, loves dry shade, and eventually it'll form a carpet of itself. So it's a really good landscaping plant for that.
What about plants that will tolerate being completely submerged for part of the season?
Oh yes. I could have talked a lot about that. I didn't mention any emergent plants, but there's a lot of really good emergents that you could use. Species like bayonet rush is one of them that comes to mind. Small spike rush is a good one. Um, any of the wetland sedges that I mentioned, like tussock sedge, the woolly fruited sedge, all of those ones can be submerged for part of the year. Um, so they have a really high tolerance for that. And of course, cattails, they're classic for that. Yeah.
And planting along the edge of the highway.
Planting along the edge of the highway. So like for like in that really kind of dry highway edge. So I often in unplanted areas, I often see sand drop seed. Just naturally. It grows really well. I'm not sure where you would get seed from that. I don't even know if there's any seed suppliers that carry it. But it loves that really dry, hard soil that nothing else will grow in, and it has a really strong root system. So it's really good for natural erosion control. And it's a grass. It's hard to tell what it looks like from photos, but it's once you see it everywhere. It's got this very distinctive sheath on it. So if you look up sand drop seed, you'll see what I mean, and you'll probably see it everywhere. Um, but barring that, switchgrass does really well up here. Um, there was an erosion control mix planted in Haliburton. When you're driving down like I forgot the main road in Haliburton, past the Independence, just before the bridge, along kind of the bike trail there's an area that was planted with savanna grass and little blue stem for erosion control. And in there, the savanna grass did the best. And then there's other places where there's been erosion control mixes planted, and I've noticed switchgrass does really well. So I'd recommend, if you can get your hands on switchgrass or savanna grass, those would be the ones to try.
Or Daniel also wants to know, are any of the plants you mentioned edible?
That's a good question. Sweetgrass definitely is edible, and cattails are great. So native, non-native cattail, whenever I go paddling, I always like to eat cattail shoots. They taste really good. There's an infinite number of ways that you can use pretty much every part of the cattail in some way that's beneficial. So cattails are probably number one. Sweetgrass. I'm not sure about any edible sedges, but I wouldn't be surprised. A fun fact too. So the order, the Poales order, grasses, rushes, and sedges, it also includes bromeliads, and pineapples are a bromeliad. So when you're eating pineapples, you're eating a grass. Kind of. It's
Who
a bit of a
knew?
stretch, but
There was a bit of a chat when you brought up the prairie tall grass about the clonal colony.
Mhm.
That struck me when you showed me the grasses at the first part of your talk, but you told me they were all individual grasses, but um, are are all the grasses individual, or is there some conal aspect to them in the same way that aspens grow in a genetically identical colony?
Definitely. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. So a lot of our native grasses would be described as bunch grasses. So like from the little tiny poverty oak grass to big blue stem, they form a bunch, but they will eventually form turf. So they'll stay as bunches, but they'll spread by rhizomes. So you'll have one bunch and then it'll spread by rhizomes and form another bunch, that sort of way, and just kind of reproduce that way. And I read, I don't remember where this was, but I don't remember if somebody told me this or if I read it, so don't quote me fully on it. But in older stands of prairie grasses like big blue stem, sometimes seed viability can go down from it being a clonal colony, but I don't know if that's always the case. I know whenever I've collected big blue stem seed, I get 100% germination, so I don't know, but that's food for thought, I guess.
I think we pretty much hit the end of the comments and questions, other than there were many that thanked you over and over again about your presentation. So I'll pass it back to Sue, but personally, I also want to thank you. I really enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Keith. Thank you.
And thank you, Keith, for looking after the Q&A. And I will add my thanks, Baz. You are truly a fund of information about all kinds of native plants, but and we all know a lot more about grasses, rushes, and sedges at the end of your presentation. So once the editing is done, the recording of this presentation will be sent to all registrants, just in case you want to see it again or share it with your friends. And while I have your attention, I want to tell you about our next event, which will be on February the 10th at 7 p.m. via Zoom. And Leora Berman is the manager of the Land Between, and she's going to be giving a talk about the natural features and functions of the highlands, the trends in wildlife populations, the approaches and information that can help with choosing balanced decisions. The information about Leora's presentation is now on our website. And if you'd like to attend, you can register for it on our website at environmenthaliburton.org. So we always send out recordings of our presentations to all registrants. So if you can't make it that night, you can always watch it later. If you feel inclined, a small donation to our organization will help us continue to put on these presentations. And you can do that by going to the membership and donations page on our website at environmenthaliburton.org. Thanks again, Baz, and to everyone who is still here that attended our event tonight. And I hope to see some of you on February the 10th. Thanks again.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everybody.